Our guest today, Dan Goelzer, is the definition of someone who has done it all. He was an auditor before he went to law school. He became the general counsel of the SEC at age 35. He was a founding member of the board for the PCAOB, was there almost a decade, was acting chair for a while, was at Baker McKenzie as a partner for a long time, and now he's the board member of the SASB. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Dan, I'm early on in the PCAO's birth. Every year, the Society of Corporate Secretaries would have a group meet with the PCAOB staff. So I actually was on the premises once a year, and it was great to meet staffers, but also learn what impact the PCAOB does have on public companies, particularly the Audit Committee. And since then, that was 15 years ago that I was doing that, the PCAOB's impact on Audit Committee activities has grown immensely, I think, since that period.
Yeah, it certainly does have a big impact. I mean, and maybe because of that, it's important to say at the beginning, just to kind of level set for everybody, the PCAOB doesn't regulate audit committees or public companies. It can't adopt any rules that audit committees have to comply with. It can't bring enforcement actions against audit committee members. Its jurisdiction is only over the auditors of public companies. But at the same time, one of the, I would say, important innovations in Sarbanes-Oxley was to make the audit committee responsible for the relationship between a public company and its auditor. So under SOX, the audit committee has to have the authority, has to be the body with the authority to hire and fire the auditor and oversee the auditor's work. And so because of that, in a sense, almost everything that the PCAOB does, because it affects the work of the auditor, also in some way affects the audit committee because it's overseeing that work. And I guess I sort of divide the effects into two categories, the general and the specific. The general is what I referred to already. Since the committee oversees the auditor, when the PCAOB changes auditing standards, that's likely to have some impact on the audit committee. The two things I point to, I guess, as the best examples in that regard are the audit of internal control over financial reporting, which is really, I think it's fair to say, sort of a revolution in auditing by requiring the auditor to render a second opinion, an opinion on the effectiveness of controls, to communicate with the audit committee about material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in controls. And it changed the nature and scope of the auditor's work. I think in a lot of cases it changed the cost of the auditor's work. So audit committees, I think, have become very involved in understanding what goes on in the ICFR audit. Another example along those lines, to me, would be what the PCAOB calls CAM reporting. They've more recently put in a requirement that the audit opinion has to include a discussion of critical audit matters, which you might kind of shorthand as what was most difficult in performing the audit, or what required the most exercise of judgment. And again, I think audit committees are quite interested in what are disclosed as CAMs for their companies, and the audit committee should consider whether it reflects something that's just sort of inherent in the company's financial reporting, or might reflect something about the company's controls or reporting procedures that suggest something that ought to change, a problem that ought to be addressed. But so that's at the general level. To be a little bit more specific, the board certainly does have rules on what the auditor or standards on what the auditor has to communicate to the audit committee. So the board's auditing standards are a major source of input as to what the audit committee hears from the auditor. There's a standard called AS number 16, which directly governs communications, and it talks about disclosing to the committee the sort of general understanding of the audit strategy and timing of audit procedures, things that the auditor learns in the course of the audit, description of critical audit policies that the company has significant unusual transactions, anything that's difficult or contentious with management. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that the auditor has to report to the audit committee on coming out of the audit. And then that in turn should provide the sort of the fuel, the fodder for the audit committee's oversight of the company's financial reporting. Second, on the specifics, the inspection of the auditor, particularly if the company's engagement is selected for inspection, can have a big effect on the audit committee's work. I mean, we'll talk about that separately. So I won't go into detail on that now, but the and also in recent years, the PCAOB has become more active in just putting out sort of general guidance for audit committees, information that it feels that will be helpful for audit committees in discharging their work. I mean, they had something recently on interviews with audit committee chairs about how COVID has affected their relationship with the auditor. Each year they try to identify what they think will be important issues in the inspections that year and what were the significant issues turned up in inspections in the prior year. And I certainly, my advice to audit committees would be to, read those things, which are usually quite short and understandable, and consider whether the issues that the board is identifying would be important in the context of their particular company.
Yeah, those annual staff observations are definitely important to read, and like you said, they're an easy read for any audit committee member. So, as I understand it, when the PCAOB inspects an auditor, they're going to pull specific audit reports from public companies to review to see how the auditor did in the audit. And if they have concerns about a particular audit, it would seem like it's a good idea for the audit committee to know that this quasi-regulatory agency had concerns about an audit. How does the audit committee ever, they can't go to the PCAOB to ask questions because they're not regulated by the PCAOB. So you would have to go to your own auditor and say, did the PCAOB have concerns about your performance on our audit or our performance on the audit? How does that work?
Well, I think this is pretty common advice now. I would certainly advise audit committees to have an understanding with your auditor that as soon as the auditor finds out that your engagement, this company's engagement is going to be inspected, that the audit committee be notified so that they're aware of that. And I think that's pretty commonly done now. I mean, as you kind of suggest in the question, with one exception, I'll mention in a minute, the PCAOB won't have any contact with the company itself. They don't have jurisdiction over the company. They're looking at the way the auditor performed its work. But that can have an important spillover effect on the company, particularly if they determine that the auditor might have missed something in the company's financial reporting, or that there could be an independence problem with the auditor. So if I were on an audit committee, I'd want to know that my engagement was selected for review. And then beyond that, if I don't have to know everything that happens as the inspection unfolds, but if something comes up that suggests there might be a problem with the company's financial reporting, I think I'd want to be alerted to that along the way too, and understand how the auditor is gonna respond. So yes, I think it's definitely something the audit committee should have an early warning system for if their engagement is pulled or is selected for inspection.
So how might a PCAOB inspection then spur the audit committee and the company's financial staff to act in response to the inspection results?
Yeah, well, maybe I should say at the beginning that one thing that might happen is that the audit committee chair might be contacted. I think I said a minute ago that the PCAOB doesn't deal with the company or doesn't contact the company directly. The exception to that is that they do pretty frequently interview the audit committee chair, I think largely to get a perspective on the nature and quality of communications between the auditor and particularly the engagement partner and the audit committee chair. And also, I think, again, in recent years, they've just used it as an opportunity for audit committee chairs to ask any questions they'd like to about the sort of, what the PCAOB's mission in conducting the inspection is, just to be a communications channel between audit committee chairs and the PCAOB. But so, how might the company or the audit committee be affected, or what might they be spurred to do? I'd say the most significant thing is that while it's the exception rather than the rule, there certainly are cases where the PCAOB staff concludes as part of the inspection that the auditor missed a gap violation. In other words, so some error in the company's financial statements. More often they're looking at whether appropriate and adequate audit evidence was gathered, and even if it wasn't, that doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with the financial statements. It just means that the audit wasn't correct. But sometimes they do identify problems in the company's financial reporting, and then that then would put a burden on the company to consider whether it needs to restate its financials or make some kind of correction. The PCAOB, of course, isn't what I'll call the decider of those kinds of questions. That's really a question between the SEC and the company. And the SEC, I would say, doesn't always agree with the PCAOB when the PCAOB thinks there's a reporting problem. But certainly, if it's a major issue, if it's something material, the company is probably going to, and they think the answer isn't clear, the company is going to want to meet with the SEC staff, discuss the issue, get the SEC's views, and then decide how to react. I mean, I think there certainly are cases where once the issue is identified, the company recognizes that there's a problem and simply restates without necessarily having to discuss it with the SEC. But many cases, these are difficult technical questions, and the company would want to pursue it with the commission. There are also cases where the board identifies some sort of independence problem that the auditor has missed or ignored, and that's something that the company has to be concerned about too. I mean, strictly speaking, it's the company's obligation to file an audit report prepared by an independent auditor. So if the auditor turns out not to be independent, then again, at least in theory, the company has committed a violation. So often these are issues that the audit committee will consider, try to reach a determination about whether the auditor's independence is actually impaired. And these issues are often then discussed with the chief accountant's office also, before a final decision is made about how to address the problem. So I guess I would say that those are the main kinds of company responses that you're likely to have to an inspection. I mean, again, most inspections don't produce these kinds of issues about the company's financial reporting, but a significant percentage do, and that's why the audit committee should be aware that the inspection is taking place.
So let's flip angles here and talk about annual due diligence that the audit committee, who has the responsibility to hire their independent auditor every year, when they're deciding whether to re-engage that auditor for another engagement, another year. How does the PCAOB's role come into play here? Because the audit committee someone on the audit committee might read in the news that their auditor has issues with other companies, with other audits. What sort of diligence, what sort of questions should they be asking their lead auditor?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the things that the audit committee tries to get a handle on in the annual review, to some extent parallel what the PCAOB is trying to look at in its inspection process. The firm's system of quality control, objectivity and professional skepticism. This is an overall evaluation of the effectiveness and quality of the audit firm. So again, I would come back to the inspection report. I certainly think part of the annual discussion with the auditor ought to be around, well, what's in the PCAOB's inspection report, even if your engagement wasn't inspected. I think the audit committee would ask questions like, well, were there issues that the PCAOB found in other engagements that could also affect our engagement? And if so, how are you addressing those? What did the PCAOB determine about your system of quality control, and what changes, or what the board calls it, remediation, might you be making in your controls? I mean, here it's good to keep in mind that an inspection report has two parts. There's a public part, which would discuss in general terms deficiencies that the inspectors found in specific audit engagements. But the companies are never named. They're referred to as like issuer A, issuer B, issuer C, and so on. But you can get a general sense of what the nature of the deficiencies were. Then there's a non-public part of the report that talks about the firm's system of quality control and any I don't know, weaknesses or criticisms that the board had of that system. That part of the report remains non-public forever unless the firm fails to remediate the issues that the PCAOB has addressed. But there's no reason why the audit committee can't ask the firm to tell it, at least in general terms, what did the PCAOB find about your system of quality control, and what are you doing about it? I think would be an important insight in evaluating the firm, and part of the input into making decisions about whether to retain it for another year or not.
Well, I know you love this stuff, and I'm so grateful for you sharing your institutional knowledge, your wide breadth of knowledge, and your monthly newsletter is always a must read. Just love it.
Well, thank you. I do think these are interesting issues. They might not appeal necessarily to everybody, but it's a fascinating world, and of course, the integrity of financial reporting is really key to everybody in the markets and in securities regulation.
Well, certainly important to audit committees.
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.